name is Jerry Cattell. I live in Portmarnock in Dublin.
I'm Breed Cattell. I live in Portmarnock. I'm married to Jerry. We have 2 children, Jack, aged 13, and Laura, who'll be 10 in August.
In 1996, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The symptoms that I experienced around that time was minor sort of movements in my shakiness in my hand and just a slight tremor. And that was sort of evidence when I was trying to put a key in the door, take a coin out of my pocket.
He was 34 at the time and I was 27, and we were only 3 years married. And as you can imagine, we were devastated. But when we got over the initial shock, we just kind of carried on as normal. We didn't tell very many people, just as family, very close friends.
Prior to being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, I led a fairly active life. I was heavily involved in sport. I played a lot of golf, football. Generally, I was quite an active individual.
Loads of energy, absolutely. Always loved golf, so he'd play golf 7 days a week if you let him. But in the beginning, he wasn't on any medication. In fact, to look at him, you wouldn't know there was anything wrong with him. And he stayed off medication for about 7 years, I think. Our son was born in 2003. And then I think he slowed down a little bit, and I said, I think you might need to have that reviewed.
At that stage, in around 2003, these conditions had increased, and it was felt at the time that my next appropriate step was to go on oral medication. The dosage of the medication I was taking at that time was increased over the next maybe 5 to 6 years. The benefits that I was getting from the oral medication gradually began to diminish.
Everything started to really slow down, and he wasn't as much help to me with the children as he had been. He just didn't live a normal life from 2013 on. It would take him a long time to get dressed in the morning. He would struggle to get out of bed.
Stiffness, mobility problems, freezing, walking through a doorway, I'd stop.
And the periods between on and off periods were getting shorter and shorter. So he would struggle, like he would shuffle around the house, kind of freeze after an hour. And then if he took the tablets again, they'd kick in for a little while and he would be able to do a few things. But the periods were getting shorter and shorter for the tablets working.
The oral route, particularly in Parkinson's disease where gastric emptying is a little bit inefficient, is suboptimal, and patients have tablets that often sit around and are not absorbed.
The oral medication really wasn't kicking in, and I was getting the severe peaks and troughs of being good and then being bad, of being good and being bad, and those sort of peaks and trough periods were becoming more frequent during the normal course of the day.
So most patients who arrive at the point where we're having a discussion about advanced therapies have reached a point in their disease where they're taking multiple daily doses of levodopa. And often there's a significant up and down or on and off type effect from dose to dose. And it's often when patients reach that point where in their own mind they're aware that oral tablet-based medication doesn't give them the quality of life they need.
There was, if I was to pick out one defining moment, it was being in the supermarket one day and freezing, and just standing there in the middle of the aisle, and people walking up and looking up and down, and saying to themselves, "What's wrong with that man there? Like, he's just stuck. He hasn't moved."
So it's then that we knew that something had to change, and that the medication he was on wasn't working, and it was time to look at something else.
Initially, when I was informed about an alternative medication being the Duodopa, it was explained to me that it was a pump, and it was the drug was pumped into, it was going into your system on an even basis during the day.
So Duodopa is a simple mechanical approach to bypass the process by which a tablet has to make its way from the mouth to the blood-brain barrier, where it has its effect within the nervous system.
It entailed an invasive procedure. It involved having a tube hanging out of your body. What was it like to have a tube sticking out of your stomach, and how big was this tube going to be? How long is it going to be? Where is it going to stop, and how am I going to hide it? All those kind of questions were sort of flashing through my mind at the time.
So I was a bit apprehensive as to what is involved in that. But we went to see a patient who had it, and he showed us the tube, showed us the cassette, told us how it worked, and told us how bad his quality of life had been beforehand.
He was actually worse than I was. Like, he was falling repeatedly, and he went on the Duodopa, and he said his life transformed. And gone and met him in his house, and coming home that night, I said to Breed, I think this is the route to go, let's do it.
Duodopa is a gel formulation of levodopa that can be delivered directly into the intestine via a tube placed in the abdominal wall. The gel is pumped from a cassette worn in a holster, on a belt, or hidden within the clothing. The infusion runs continuously throughout the day and is typically removed before going to bed. The pump allows for intermittent bolus or booster doses when required to ensure symptom control is adequate for most of the day. It's the same drug that we use in oral levodopa preparations such as Cinemet or Stalevo. So there's nothing new about the actual chemical used, but it's the mode of delivery that's different, and it allows us to bypass that roller coaster of ons and offs that patients experience because of that inefficient oral route of medication.
When I decided to go the Duodopa route, I was admitted into hospital in November of 2014, and there was an initial phase of effectively testing the Duodopa.
This test phase involves mimicking the effect of the drug being delivered through a semi-permanent PEG tube by placing a fine, flexible tube nasogastrically, so it's passed through the back of the nose into the stomach, which is a relatively simple thing to do, and then connecting that tube to the Duodopa pump.
The first 5 days were involved, were the most difficult 5 days I had experienced in the whole process. It's effectively just 5 days of maybe discomfort that you have to sort of accept and try and sort of continue with it and not to get disillusioned.
And this gives the patient the ability to essentially test drive the system. If they feel that this is not something for them, if they find the pump is too bulky or the Duodopa is not what they expect it to be, the tube can be simply removed from the nose and they can go home and go back to the regimen they would have had beforehand.
And while he was uncomfortable, I think they let him out 2 days in a row, and he just came home and tried to do normal things. He could see a big difference in that trial period.
The nasojejunal testing phase generally runs quite smoothly. There can be 1 or 2 days where movement can be a little bit slow and erratic, where we're trying to get the rate of flow to a point where it's sufficient to meet their needs.
And gradually, throughout maybe the first 4 or 5 days, as the drug is administered into and the dosage might be increased, you do find an immediate benefit. Like compared to the oral medication, when I take my oral medication in the morning time, it could be 2-3 hours before it really kicks in and you're up and running. Whereas with the Duodopa, I always remember maybe after about 2 days of it, all of a sudden one morning, having taken my initial morning dose at 8 o'clock, by 9 o'clock it was a complete transformation, and I was up and running around the room in the hospital. After the 5 days, there was a very encouraging result And at that stage then I was agreed then I would proceed with getting the pump and the peg through my stomach.
This involves a gastroenterologist performing an OGD or an orogastroduodenoscopy. That's a camera being placed down into the stomach under some sedation, so most patients will not be aware of what's going on during the procedure. And they use that procedure then to fashion a communication between the inside of the stomach and the outside world, effectively a stoma, which is a small hole through which the duodopa can be infused into the stomach and through a tube that then passes down to the jejunum where the drug is absorbed.
It literally kicked in very quickly and made a big difference. I think he was only in hospital for a week afterwards, just adjusting to it.
Many patients will feel better than they've ever felt before, although they really are on the same medication they were on before having the procedure done. The difference being is the reliability and the consistency of their response. But that in itself can be transformative from patients.
My first couple of days at home, I was very nervous of sort of watching the pump and carrying it around. It took some getting used to. It was a period of some sort of fear as to know, am I doing this right? But with the help of the Duodopa nurses, they're always there to help you.
Every day, he was getting more and more used to it. I'd say it took a couple of weeks to really get used to it, but I think overall it was a fast adjustment.
There was one particular a moment when I was at home and everything was rigged up, and I got up and put on my early morning dosage, and I actually felt my body actually changing within about an hour, and being terrific then for about 3 to 4 or 5 hours on the dosage. At that time, and I think that it was that particular time it was, yes, this is definitely for me. I've made the right choice.
Duodopa is not a cure for Parkinson's, of course, and patients will still experience some of the non-drug responsive features that we know emerge for many patients over the years, such as memory difficulty, swallowing difficulty, or balance difficulties. But we manage all these different facets in different ways.
This is the Duodopa pump. There's a couple of buttons on it which are used to control your dosages. Simple buttons that are explained to you in the hospital. This is the actual drugs cassette. Literally it just fits in there like that. You just twist it and it connects in. And this is the tube which goes into the tube which coming from your jejunum out through your stomach. The pump, to be honest, is quite cumbersome and it's heavy, and I find it a little bit awkward at times, particularly if you're a sporty person and you're active.
And the pump is relatively large and has to be carried around throughout the day while the infusion is being used. Most patients manage it though, however, and after a period of time with the pump it becomes second nature, and there are a number of holsters or modified clothing that can be used to accommodate the pump in a discreet and easily used fashion. I'm
thrilled with it at the moment, obviously you do have good days and bad days still, but some of the old symptoms of freezing has stopped. I am now more able to do things which I couldn't do 18 months ago. I am more flexible, my movement, my general appearance. I'm playing tennis, playing golf, coaching young kids. But in general, I'd have to say it's been a tremendous boost to my life and to the life of my family as well.
It's totally changed your life. He's able to do, I think, everything, maybe a little slower basis. Like, I went away myself for a few days last week and I could leave him and know that everything was okay, that he'd look after the children. Before Duodopa, I wouldn't have heard tell of going anywhere.
I feel good in myself. I'm now not sort of conscious of sort of trying to disguise or trying to hide some of the symptoms which would be evident in under the old oral medication.
If he has an off period, he can press his button and it gives him a little boost, and 20 minutes later he's back to being himself. And it is great. It has made a huge difference to our life.